Considering my love for Breath of the Wild, Biomutant is a nearly impossible game for me to review. Despite what the developers would have you believe, these two titles are at complete opposite ends of the open world spectrum. Breath of the Wild gives the player so much freedom that you can head straight to the final boss after finishing the tutorial. Biomutant is very restrictive in the way it wants you to approach it and will go great measures to make sure you do everything the way it wants you to do it. Breath of the Wild is very lax, with its sparse music, understated plot, and lack of overwhelming objectives within its main quest. Biomutant, on the other hand, has frequent on-screen tutorials, a far too interruptive story, and there is a narrator constantly talking over everything that you do. It has a multitude of flaws in its structure, and is just barely redeemed from being a complete disaster by some surface-level elements. The story of Biomutant is one of its worst offenses. The three design pillars that influence the narrative are about joining a tribe and expanding it by taking down rival outposts, hunting down 4 world-eating monsters that are hurting the roots of a big tree, and unveiling the mystery of your character's past. All 3 plotlines play out in complete solitude from each other and revolve around different characters, but everything blends together thanks to the forgettable dialogue, both from the NPCs and the inconsequential dialogue options the character you play as is given. I say the character you play as rather than you because there's a huge disconnect between you and your character. Aside from the fact that you play as a genetically mutated cat-like creature, the main reason for this separation is because your character can understand the language that is used throughout the world and you cannot. This is where the narrator comes in. Pushing to the side his cheesy and unnecessary remarks that disrupt the flow of the game, the narrator is so annoying because of the manner in which he translates dialogue. It makes characters feel flat when I have to hear what they are saying from a third-person perspective. Even without the narrator, though, most of the NPCs seem bland, as if their inclusion is just there to make the world feel more realistic. The game even programs in the ability to speak to useless civilians just so you can let them know you don't have time to talk. The important characters, while more varied in their conversation skills, will often subject you to expository dialogue that consists of information you could have learned just as easily from looking at the mission objective. From these types of individual conversations to the overarching narratives, anything the game has to say, I don't want to hear it. As if the story wasn't bad enough, the questline that carries it makes it even more forgettable. For the most part, the main missions are stretched out into multiple smaller objectives that are on par with side content in an Ubisoft game. While only being 10 hours long, Biomutant gets stale halfway through because of the repetitive fetch quests. You'll find yourself going back and forth between characters in order to teach them new information, catching certain numbers of creatures, and being forced to overcome hordes of enemies to obtain loot. These types of repetitive objectives would barely be acceptable for an MMO, but to see them in a game like Biomutant, I was extremely disappointed. The best missions in the game are the ones where you capture outposts for your tribe, but even they come with caveats. The issue is in a lack of freedom. Each outpost has a specific scripted way to get in. Considering how overly ambitious the game's various mechanics are, I was disappointed to not see one of them be the ability to command your tribe to capture outposts the way you want them to. Even still, these combat-oriented missions remain more engaging than the other ones in the game because they're less copy and pasted. One of Biomutant's biggest flaws, as I and many others will point out, roots from the overambition of the developers. The game contains a mishmash of genre-bending ideas with little cohesion to string them together. It's a post-apocalyptic open-world game with an emphasis on its kung fu combat, with RPG elements, and there's a morality system and a tribe system that contribute to its narrative. These different ideas will often contradict each other. The combat is going on its own, but the scripted encounters that sometimes occur overhaul the sense of player agency that should be felt within an open-world game. The RPG elements are a nice addition, but since you can fight enemies to get stronger, boss fights that should be brooding may be an easy task to some players depending on their level. The story can seem interesting at times, but the surplus of cutscenes tends to get in the way of gameplay. Many of Biomutant's ideas, good and bad, exist on their own without any consideration for the rest of the game. Even if there was any cohesiveness, the sheer number of ideas leaves each one to feel underwhelming. If there was one aspect that stood out though, it was the combat. Although largely superfluous, there is a great amount of depth to the customization of the combat and the combat itself. There's a wide variety of different types of melee and ranged weapons, and the best part is that you can swap weapons on the go. You can also unlock psi abilities and mutations, which, while unable to do much damage, can be used to string together some cool combos. Your moveset is quite varied, but it's more flash than show. Nothing feels that much more effective in killing enemies than just hitting them with melee attacks. Many of the Wung Fu moves you're able to learn aren't going to be helpful in the more gimmicky boss fights, and they certainly aren't needed for smaller enemy encounters, leaving them to feel mostly useless. The lack of necessity for customization did let me down, but nevertheless, the combat is satisfying. Alongside the world, it's one of the game's strongest aspects. Once you overcome a very linear, painstaking first couple hours, Biomutant allows you to explore at your own pace and view the beautiful scenery, which is honestly incredible. Many of my favorite moments from this game are when I was just able to explore the lush environments without accounting for what the game wanted me to do. The studio clearly put a lot of effort into the look of the world. But I know well that the quality of an open world game comes in the form of structure, not beauty. An important question to ask is, should this game be open world? And in the grand scheme of things, the answer is yes, absolutely. Many of the game's overarching concepts can only work in that formula. The 4 World Eaters are pretty much equivalent to the Divine Beasts in Zelda, and you need to trek across the map to kill them. The Tree of Life, being both the centerpiece to the world and the story, is just genius. And the RPG level system forces you to hunt down and engage with enemies along your adventure. However, on a smaller scale, the game fails to account for its own open world structure. Biomutant is at its best when you have no sense of awareness about what you're missing out on, just taking the world for what it is at its surface level. But when you explore the villages, buildings, and sewers, you realize that you're not missing out on much. The deliberacy and variety to the world largely come in the form of ruins with hidden loot and haphazardly designed side missions. There's Bioshock-esque tacked-on puzzle solving. The linear combat encounters, dead ends, and segmented story beats completely overshadow your sense of control and freedom. There's so little substance to this game that the entire soundtrack is only a half hour long. Its restrictive nature and lack of content throughout left me asking why Biomutant was open world in the first place. It fails to connect with the ideas in the rest of the game, but then again, so does everything here. Biomutant is uninspired and underwhelming. Its most promising aspects, the flashy combat and rich locales, are trampled over by a sea of bad design choices, a lackluster story, and horrible missions. There is zero cohesion between the 3 overarching narratives or between its gameplay mechanics, and its consistent reluctance to let players tackle the game the way they want to leaves the open world to seem like little more than a backdrop. All in all, it ends up feeling like something out of a yearly franchise, rather than a passion project 6 years in the making. I am utterly disappointed.